Hey y'all, today we're going to look at the last of the virtues and the fruit of the Spirit, and that's self-control. Many of the older versions of the Bible translate this word as temperance, but that word creates confusion in our culture today because it's mainly associated with abstinence from the use of alcohol. But this word has a broader meaning than just that one issue in our lives. The word should be translated self-control because it has to do with our attitude towards sin in our lives. There's a misunderstanding about the Christian life out there that somehow when we become Christians that we don't have to deal with sin anymore. That's just not true. Sin is still something that we have to deal with as Christians. And that struggle is part of the evidence of God's presence in our lives. There are two views in the Christian community about sin in our lives. The first one is that if you're really a Christian, you don't sin. Well, when we look at the scriptures, we see that that's just not a biblical theology. It's not a biblical point of view at all. In fact, in Romans 7, Paul says, I know what I'm supposed to do and I don't do it. And I know what I'm not supposed to do and I do that. In fact, he calls himself, oh, what a wretched man that I am. You see, the struggle with sin is real. The other end of the spectrum are the people who say, well, you know what, I'm going to heaven anyway, so it doesn't matter if I sin. That too is bad theology. It's not a biblical teaching. In Romans 6, Paul said, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? He said, God forbid. Our lives ought to be marked with the fact that we are struggling and we are striving with and we are beginning to win those small victories over sin in our lives. It's always going to be a struggle. We're always going to have issues that we deal with. Every one of us have temptations. Every one of us have weaknesses. We all struggle with sin. There's none righteous. And we ought to understand that. But when we look at our lives, we see that the Spirit of God's presence in our lives begins to work in our lives incrementally to strengthen us so that instead of making bad decision after bad decision, we begin to learn. We begin to make good decisions in our lives. We begin to find those small victories one at a time. It's often one step forward and two steps back, and then two steps forward and one step back. But God is faithful. And when we look at our lives and we see the very presence of God there, and we see the fruit of his presence, the fruit of his Spirit, we see that God is working in us so that we're not just instinctive people. We don't just act like animals, which means that we just do whatever we want to do without any consequences or thought or feeling about it. What we do is we find that God's Spirit begins to work in us, and he begins to show us the things that are pleasing to him. And he begins to teach us and discipline us when we do the things that are not pleasing to him. And we begin to see self-control. It's interesting that it's named self-control because the reality is that the only way we can have that is through the power of God working within us. And when he works through us by his Spirit, we begin to see our lives transform. We begin to see ourselves doing things differently than we did before. And we begin to see ourselves desiring to do different things than we did before. And that is the fruit of the Spirit. When you learned to ride a bicycle, you didn't just hop on the bike and ride away. In fact, learning to ride a bicycle is one of the most painful things that you can do. You fall and you skin your knee and you get up and you struggle. And then finally you begin to ride that bike on two wheels, and you begin to do it, but you're still not proficient at it. But the more you do it, the better you get at it. And that's a picture of what this idea of self-control is. We begin to grow and we begin to follow Christ, and we begin to find those full victories and those small victories, and we begin to see God working in that way. And when we do, we get confidence and we're able to trust him and to walk with him all the more. It's a walk that will not be completed in this side of heaven, but it's a glorious thing to look at our lives and to see the change that God can make in us if we allow him and his Spirit to transform us, so that not only our actions are changed, but our desires are changed as well. And so self-control becomes something that is a fruit of our lives, the fruit of his presence there. May God lead you as you walk and follow him today. God bless you.